for being here. This is the first Richard's Workplace, Safe Workplace Lecture Series lecture of 2023. We have with us here today Karin Reed, who is a former broadcast journalist out of Pittsburgh. She won a couple Emmys and did some amazing work in that area, and then decided to take that experience and start her own business called Speaker Dynamics. She's the CEO of Speaker Dynamics, where she does a lot of really cool things, helping people understand how to communicate effectively through the camera. And that includes, in the case of some of the folks in here, communicating effectively to your patients through the camera in a telehealth experience. So she's going to talk a little bit about those kinds of experiences and share a little bit of background about how we got connected. And so I'm not going to share that now. I'm going to let her tell those stories. But do join me in welcoming Karin Reed.
To all of you for being here today, and please feel free to continue to enjoy your lunch. I did not eat ahead of time because I'm always afraid of having spinach in my teeth as I'm lecturing. So I am Karin Reed, and maybe 5 years ago, I would have thought I'd never be in this position to be lecturing this particular audience, right? What could I possibly have of value to share with those of you in the healthcare industry? Well, things changed, right? The world changed, and so did the way we deliver healthcare. So that's why there was this kind of collision of expertise that brings me to you today. So in order to explain what I do, allow me to share what I did. So this is indeed me. I have different hair, maybe bigger shoulder pads, but I work primarily as a broadcast journalist. I work for NBC. I was based in New England, won an Emmy along the way, interviewed luminaries like Muhammad Ali. Then I left the business to apply my skills in the corporate world. And what I found is that I would be brought in as the professional on-camera spokesperson. But more and more often, they would bring people in from the corner office or even the corner cubicle to appear on camera alongside of me and expect them to perform at the same level of skill. That often did not go well. So I saw a business opportunity to teach business professionals how to be better on-camera communicators. So that's really how Speaker Dynamics was born. And I did this for about a decade, and then there was another collision of expertise with your own Dr. Joe Allen, because we were both working for a mutual client as subject matter experts. And we were asked to do a webinar on the future of meetings. That was in March 2020. So think back about what was going on in March of 2020. Well, this was week 1 of March 2020, and we postulated at that time that in 5 to 10 years, there would be a ton of meetings where video would be at their core. Well, then like 2 weeks later, all that we said would happen in 5 years happened in like 2 weeks. So, and we had this major shift to virtual meetings. And it completely changed how all of us were interacting. It also changed, how you were meeting with your patients in all likelihood. So that's really what I'm here to talk to you about today, because there was this exponential increase in telehealth as a result of COVID. So prior to the pandemic, maybe a handful of people were using telehealth, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe about 5% of HCPs were actually using telehealth. During the pandemic, that actually rose to 2/3. And it continues to be an important way to meet with patients today. It's a vital avenue for access. And in the past, maybe it was mostly used for specialty medicine that was being delivered to rural areas. But now it's used across a broad range of specialties, a broad swath of geographies. And even in the area where I am from, which is Raleigh, North Carolina, there's a big gastroenterology program, and they use telehealth all the time. And one of their leads said this: even in our field of gastroenterology, you can learn a lot from looking at a patient, asking him to press his belly, and looking at his expression. That tells us a lot. So you actually can get a lot out of a telehealth visit, even though you're not in the same physical room. But you might be asking yourself, can you truly connect with a patient through a camera lens? Is that possible? Can it be a satisfying experience for both you as well as the patient? So today I'm going to give you some strategies that you can employ in order to better ensure that it is. And so at a high level, here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about having the right mental mindset. And really, this is critical when it comes to communicating effectively through a camera. We'll talk about purposeful pausing, why it's important, but also why it's so difficult in a virtual space. We'll also talk about eye contact for engagement, and this is the one that is always challenging and I get a lot of questions about. And then lastly, we'll wrap up by talking about maximizing your on-camera setup. And this is really how you show up on webcam. It actually really does matter. So we'll give you some specific tips that you can use to improve the way you show up on webcam right from the get-go. If you ask Joe, he knows that I love to have questions throughout the sessions. So feel free. If you have a question, this is very informal, raise your hand. Happy to address it in the moment. I also will be stopping periodically along the way to see if there are any questions that have popped up in your mind. But let's make it an interactive session. If you have a question, I can guarantee you somebody else has the same question. So without further ado, let's dive in. Let's talk about how I begin any sort of on-camera training, whether it's in telehealth or in business. And it begins with the MVPs of on-camera success. And that is not most valuable player, but rather the mental, the vocal, and the physical. So there's a whole curriculum that goes with the MVPs, but I'm going to choose the elements that are most relevant for you in the healthcare industry and for telehealth specifically. So I want to begin though with the mental mindset because this is a critical component. If you get the right mental mindset in place, everything else kind of works out because it changes the way you communicate physically, it changes the way you communicate vocally if you have things straight up here. So I have an odd question for you. I know it's weird, but try to go to that place. When you are talking through a webcam to a patient, how many people do you imagine you're talking to? Okay, what does it feel like to you when you're talking through a webcam? I'm going to give you 4 choices and we're going to vote with our hands. Okay, so do you feel like you're talking to no one? Do you feel like you're talking to an infinite number of people? Do you feel like you're talking to one person? Oh, okay. Do you feel like you're just talking to one person, or do you feel like you're talking to, the number of people who are on the call? All right, so those are your 4 choices. So raise your hand if you feel like you're talking to no one when you're talking on a webcam. Okay, a couple people. Raise your hand if you feel like you're talking to an infinite number of people. Yep, all right. Raise your hand if you feel like you're talking to just one person. Okay, and then cheating. Okay, raise your hand if you feel like you're talking to the number of people who are on the call with you. Okay, that seems kind of logical, right? All right, if you said one person, you get a gold star for the day today because that is always the case. No matter how many people are on that particular call with you, no matter how many people are in the visit, they all feel like you're talking just to them. So I first discovered this whenever I would go to the grocery store when I worked in TV news. And I was based in Rhode Island, so pardon the accent, but I have to do it. So people would come up to me in the store and be like, Karin Reed, how are your kids? When do you get your hair cut? I mean, they would talk to me like I was a good friend, like I was a family member. And I thought, that's kind of weird. But then I thought about it. I was coming into their homes almost on a daily basis. And they developed this relationship with me, this closeness to me that I couldn't necessarily reciprocate because I wasn't receiving information back from them. But it's important to remember how that feels to them because it's really a conversation that you're having when you're on a telehealth visit. And it should be that by design. And it's a pretty close conversation. It's this intimate conversation that you're having with them because you're as close to them as your eyes to your webcam and their eyes to their screen. And because it's this kind of close conversation, you have to understand the boundaries of it. You don't want to go into what I call presenter mode, which is what I'm kind of doing right now. I'm projecting my voice. I am using big gestures because I have the space to do that. If you would try to do that on webcam, at best, it's going to look inappropriate. At worst, it's going to look fake. So you have to get in your brain that I'm having a conversation with somebody who I just can't see as well as I'd like to, but it is a conversation. So it's easier to do that if you do just have one person on the call with you. They have their camera on, and it feels more natural. Harder to do, though, if people haven't turned their camera on. Or they have their camera on and it's pointing at the ceiling, or you're seeing a section of their face. it's really difficult to have a conversation with a chin. But what I would suggest to you in that case is visualize your viewer. You know, think about the person you're talking to. Visualize their faces and how they're reacting to what you're saying, because that will help you to better connect with them. How do you reach them? You reach them through the camera. The camera is the conduit to your conversation partner. So as a result, all of your energy needs to be poured into that camera lens. So the other challenge that we have from a mental mindset standpoint is we have so many distractions that could potentially derail us. So even if you've carved out a space to have telehealth visits and it's pretty private, you still have to manage what I would call two realities. You have the reality that is what is seen on the screen, but you also have the reality of everything off camera. And you want to make sure that they don't realize that anything crazy is going off camera. So just to give you an example, I was actually hosting a live interview and a light bulb went off in the middle of it. And apparently it was a really important thing that needed to be fixed immediately as I'm doing this live interview. And so one of the crew members came out, set up a ladder, climbs the ladder, and is changing the light bulb. I'm doing a live interview and this guy's like maybe 5 feet from me. And I knew what was going on, but nobody else did. But I had to act like nothing was going on out of the ordinary outside of what was in view of the camera. So you still have to think about this whenever you're doing a telehealth visit, because you could be sitting in that visit and hear, somebody, chatting loudly down the hall, and you might naturally want to go like this and try to see what's going on. But people on the other side don't know what's going on. So you really have to focus on the on-camera reality, which is just this space, what the camera is showing. So I want to pause here before we go into the next element. Any questions that are cropping up in your mind right now related to Joe?
How do you avoid making them anxious, like a close talker type situation?
Oh, that's actually really a great suggestion. So, and this gets to kind of like the on-camera webcam setup. Recognize, and I feel like you have some experience with this, recognize that the way you frame yourself, the way you're showing up on camera is going to impact how they perceive you. So have you ever been in a situation, you're sitting close, I'm so sorry, I'm going to pick on you. And sorry, Facebook Live people, just 1 second. So if somebody's talking to you like this and you're like, this is super uncomfortable. Really yeah, exactly. You're like, please move back. Right, exactly. So we can do that on camera as well, but we don't realize that we're doing it because we can't fully assess our distance between us and our conversation partner. So be conscious of that. If you are really close to your camera and they see just a little piece of you, it's going to feel like you are in their face, and they're going to want to push you back and say, you're invading my personal space. So it's really, and I'm going to give you some specific tips on how to frame yourself so that you don't freak people out in that regard. Any other questions with what I've covered so far? Yes?
I noticed with a lot of meetings, what you said, kind of being distracted.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you found other than practice that helped you kind of ignore those outside factors, or somebody talking when you're talking, or things like that that kind of are out of your control?
So a couple of things that you can try. I mean, I honestly try to pretend like I'm a horse with blinders on so that I'm not distracted by what's just, my peripheral vision. But also, if you have a challenge related to audio, people hate wearing those headsets, but boy, are they good at canceling out the noise for the people on the other side, but also helping you to stay better focused. So if you can kind of create this sound bubble for yourself, which allows yourself to stay better focused on the call. Other thoughts?
I have one
Sure.
question. So I've seen that there's an AI add-in app that can help adjust your eyes so that they stay focused on the camera even if you're looking. Have you seen those,
I
experienced anything?
have. I don't think that the technology is perfect yet. I still think it looks a little odd. But we're going to be talking, it's just the honest truth. I will give you an eye contact strategy that is not reliant upon AI, which we know sometimes works and sometimes does not. We experience technology fickleness today. So, it's just something I would not want to rely upon until it gets better. But they're working on it. They're working on it because it definitely is an issue. But let's actually kind of shift gears and talk about the second of the MVPs, which is vocal variety. And there are really 3 tools that you have at your disposal. You have pitch, you have pace, and you have pauses. I want to focus in though on the last one, on unleashing the power of the pause. The reason why I'm going to focus in on this one related to telehealth is because it provides probably the most value for you in ensuring that those who are engaged in that visit are finding it satisfying and effective. Because whenever you're in a virtual environment, sometimes it can feel like you're talking in a vacuum, right? And when we talk into a vacuum, sometimes we miss out on opportunities to interact with those on the other side. We have a tendency to really focus on our own journey. We're in our own space, and we know we want to get from point A to point B, and we're going to get there regardless of what happens in between. However, you don't know what's going on the other side. You might have started with a whole train load full of passengers, but they might all have gotten off by the time you get to your destination. So it's really critical, especially when you're delivering patient care, that you create an opportunity for them to speak. Because sometimes we have a tendency just to kind of, like maybe we'll do a soft sell of a question. So tell me about this. But then we don't wait long enough for them to fully form their thought or to finish it. And we keep plowing through. And that is a problem on many different levels. So you really have to open up that space and get comfortable in the silence in order for you to have an effective interaction. And if you're from a Western culture, boy, is that hard. Because after about 2 seconds, we start getting really uncomfortable with silence. And we just want to jump right in and move on to the next thing, or sometimes even answer our own question. But if you're from an Eastern culture, not only is there an expectation of silence, but there's a tolerance of silence for up to 8 seconds. And if you do not give them that 8 seconds of space in which you want to create, an answer to the question or come up with a question, God bless you, they might not actually interact with you. And that's a lost opportunity. So the other challenge is, if you don't pause, you may not be sure that they're comprehending what you're saying, and you might not be getting the full story from them. So by pausing, you're ensuring your comprehension as well as theirs. So give them the space to be able to, ask questions or probe, do frequent check-ins, and wait for them to respond. Sometimes we'll do like a half-hearted, so does that make sense to you? But we don't wait for them to verbalize. We just kind of continue to move on. So pausing is so critical. But as mentioned, it's really difficult to do in this environment, right? Because you have this kind of vacuum in which you're presenting. So it requires you to be a bit more mechanical in how you pause. So here's what I would suggest. After you deliver a key takeaway, pause for 2 seconds. So say it, and then in your head, count 1,001, 1,002 before moving on to the next thing. It forces yourself to kind of sit in that pause. And then after you ask a question, wait at least 7 seconds to get a response. And 7 seconds might feel really long to you, but think about what has to happen on the other side. First of all, they have to realize that there's an expectation that they respond. Then they actually have to kind of get the courage up to answer it, because it can be intimidating to be in that environment. And sometimes if they're on mute, they have to go through the process of unmuting themselves. So 7 seconds might feel like an eternity to you, but it'll go by lightning fast for the people on the other side. So lean into that pause in order to ensure that you have good comprehension and that they interact. Questions related to the vocal variety aspect, please. Yes?
Live meetings, lectures, and that sort of thing, you have a variety of backgrounds.
Yep.
And knowledge and so forth.
Yep.
To what extent do you think these numbers may vary?
These are pretty generic, very honestly. So, I mean, and that 7 seconds, that's what's recommended by my colleagues at Duke, where I do some teaching. And just incidentally, if it's a global audience, they say, extend that to 14 seconds because of the lag. Shooting things through the bandwidth does take some time. So I think you kind of get to the point where you can judge if you need to lean into the pause a little bit more. If you're trying to pull out participation, real comfortable with that silence because at some point people will speak up. If you are in a meeting, not necessarily a telehealth visit, also empower them to use chat, because chat is a lower barrier to entry. Sometimes people feel more comfortable writing it rather than speaking it up because it can be really intimidating to be showing up on the screen with a bunch of people and having the courage to be able to speak up. So, yeah.
And the one thing I would add is, when you think about a telehealth interaction, the patient is the lower status person, right? So if you don't pause, they're going to just take your word for whatever's going on, and that's it.
Right.
And so you have to wait probably a little bit longer when you believe that they're perceiving a greater distance between you and them, from a hierarchy perspective.
And you might miss out on a key piece of information that could completely change, the course of the visit itself. But when you're in the same room with somebody, you can read their body language. You can tell if something's like slightly, off, and you can kind of push into that. You can't do that as easily in a telehealth visit. So that's why it really requires you to be more, purposeful in your pausing in order to pull that out. So the last thing I wanted to mention under the MVP's heading is eye contact, and it's under the physical factors category. Can you all find a buddy? Just stand up and find a buddy. You're not going to be hanging out long, but you need somebody to talk to. So, and even if it's like a three people, that's completely fine too. All right. Find a buddy. Okay. So here are your instructions. I want you, even if you've known each other, I want you to introduce yourself to each other, but do not look them in the eye. You can look at their shoulder, you can look right past their head, whatever it is, but take turns introducing yourself to each other without looking at each other's faces. Sorry, carry on, try it. Don't look at each other. Okay, all right, experiment on. Feel free to find your seats again. All right, so if you're an introvert, you'd be like, that was great. That felt super to me. But for most people, like, it feels different. How did it feel to you when somebody introduced themselves? How did it feel?
Weird.
Weird in what way?
Just eerie, disconnected, and like insincere too. How could you be sincere?
Yeah, yes.
So I've known Kurt for over 20 years, and it felt like he was talking to someone else, even though I knew he was talking to me. Like it was really unsettling.
Well, and guess what? When we are having a telehealth visit, we can create that same unsettling feeling whenever we're not looking at the camera. But for some reason, this is something that we all struggle with, because as human beings, we want to seek out eye contact. It's what we do. But the technology as it currently is for the masses, even though there's that AI that can kind of tweak things a little bit, for the most part, we have to manage imprecise eye contact. So if I am talking to somebody, I want to look at them in the eye, but I know when I am doing any sort of virtual visit, virtual call, I need to be looking primarily at the camera lens when I'm speaking. Because if I don't, there is this barrier that I'm creating to connection. So a quick anecdote from a client I was working with. They were in the financial services industry, and they had what is called an ITM, which is like an interactive ATM. And when people walk up to the ATM, you will have this screen pop on with a person, like a live virtual teller, but they're actually sitting somewhere in a main hub, and they're there to help you. So when they first rolled this out, their virtual tellers did not look at the camera at all. And what they found is that customers really didn't interact with them at all. It's like they thought that they were avatars. But then they tweaked things, and they started having their tellers look at the camera. And it completely changed how the interactions were with their customers. People actually started talking to them. They had conversations, but it was only when they looked at the camera. If they did look at the camera, they didn't interact. So it makes a huge, huge difference. Now, the one thing I want to point out to you is this word, primarily. Underline that primarily, okay? Because we're going to get back to that. But when you're not speaking, then you want to look at the screen. You want to look at them because then that will allow you to read their body language, which can tell you so much. We communicate so much of our message through our body language. But you might be saying, well, I need to be looking at that all the time in order to make a proper assessment of the situation. I get that. However, notice how I said look primarily at the camera lens when you're speaking. I don't want you to look like this. I don't want you to stare at the camera because then you look like you're held captive, right? You're doing like a hostage video. Instead, I want you to interact with the camera as you would with a person face to face. And we don't stare at people, it makes them feel completely uncomfortable. So we break gaze all the time. You can break gaze when you're having those conversations through telehealth. And in those moments when you look down, when you can actually capture those nonverbal cues. You don't need to be staring at them to see when they make one. You can capture that really, really quickly. When I'm on a call, I can see when somebody's nodding. I can also see when they're nodding off. And I don't need to be staring at them and waiting for them to fall asleep. But it's a little bit tricky to do. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is your nonverbal cues. Our bodies are speaking all the time. Sometimes they send the wrong signals. So you need to be conscious of how it is going to be perceived on the other side. So you need to provide context. Depending upon what your setup is, you might have a camera here, you might have your monitor here, and you need to look at both, right? Well, if you are looking over here, they might be wondering, what are they looking at? Tell them what you're looking at. If you tell them and provide that context, then and explain your eye gaze, then you can remove any possibility that that movement could be misinterpreted, misconstrued. So providing that normalcy to your body language is really critical. I was working with a client whose spouse was interviewing during the pandemic, and the entire process was, digital. And she was in her final interview with the hiring manager, and the entire time, imagine the camera's here, the hiring manager was like this, didn't look at the camera once. And she thought, oh my gosh, I am bombing this interview. Well, lo and behold, she gets the job. And a couple of months in, she told her then boss how it felt to go through that interview. And they said, oh my gosh, no, complete opposite. You were saying so many awesome things. I wanted to record everything as accurately as possible. So same people in the same meeting, totally different perceptions of how the meeting went. So providing a little bit of context removes any of that confusion. You just say, hey, my monitor's over here, so if I'm not looking at the camera, that's what I'm doing. That's all you have to say. And it makes a huge, huge difference. So I covered a lot of ground for the MVPs. We're going to launch into some elevating your personal production value, I call. But before we go, yeah.
Oh, I had a question.
Sure. Yeah.
Making or keeping eye contact.
Yes.
I'm not providing healthcare advice, but at lecturing, sometimes you have a mixed. You're doing hybrid, so you have some people in class, some
Yes.
people virtual.
Yep.
And there's almost like a hierarchy too. Well, the people are right here in front of me. I have to make eye contact with them. But is there a balance, or do you have any tips on how to balance the real in-seat versus the virtual eye contact?
Joe and I have a whole book on it. No, we talk about this in Suddenly Hybrid. And yes, there is a balance, and there's also a need to fight your proximity bias. So if you are in the room with people, of course it's going to feel much better to, interact with those who are sharing the room with you, because you get feedback from them. And sometimes it's very easy to forget the people who are on the other side of the camera lens. So it is important to actually pay attention to both. So I think about it like whenever you're at a dinner party, and you might spend maybe a little bit more time with the people who are right beside you, but in general, you're probably trying to include everybody in the table in the conversation. Do that when you teach as well. So you're spending a little bit of time here, but then you're also acknowledging the people who are on the other side of the camera lens, and hopefully you are all having a good experience as well. So it's a matter of paying attention to both so that they don't feel like they are, for example, watching a glorified live stream. And in a hybrid classroom, you always want to make sure it's not a two-tiered system, where those who are in person with you have greater access to information or even opportunity. So it's a conscious effort. It requires an intentional approach and a shifting of your mind to include them in as much as possible. One quick tip on that, which is kind of off the telehealth thing, but important to note. If you make a policy of having remote speak first, that goes a long way. Because say that you're opening up the class to discussion, you might be tempted to say, hey, Bubba, what do you think about this? Instead, I'm gonna say, hey, Mom, who is probably on the live stream, what do you think about this? And what that does is it gives them an opportunity to weigh in, but it also raises the collective awareness of everybody in the class that, hey, it's not just the people in the room, there's actually people who are joining us from afar. So I would suggest making that a policy.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about that pesky on-camera setup. So, goodness, you probably never thought you'd have to worry about this, right? Why do I have to worry about my on-camera webcam setup? That seems ridiculous. But it is important, and it's not a matter of vanity. It's a matter of showing respect for the people on the other side. You want them to receive your message and communicate with you as easily as possible. And you do that by removing distractions and maximizing what they see on the screen. So when I worked in TV news, when I worked in video production, I had a whole slew of people who ensured I looked and sounded my best. But now, you know, we're all on camera. We're all our own production crew, often without professional expertise. So I'm going to highlight some specific things that I would focus on. Also realizing that some of you have your telehealth situation set up for you. You have no way of changing it, but if you can influence that in any way, then I would consider that a win. So the first thing that you want to think about is your set, and you want it to be simple. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically you want it to be uncluttered and with a little bit of depth. So uncluttered, you know, pretty self-explanatory. You don't want there to be a mess behind you, but you also don't want anything back there that will pull focus. So I want to pull a story from Joe's experience. He's like, what are you talking about? So Joe in his home office has a beautiful background, bookshelves with like some interesting, you know, objects to art, and he also has, you know, obviously a bunch of books. And he didn't really think about what books were on that shelf because you had all your academic tomes there, but he also had the Twilight series that was on the shelf, and he had a bunch of his students, you know, reach out to, it was afterwards, and said, we didn't know that you were a Twilight fan. So be aware that you might think people are not noticing what's behind you. They totally are. So you want to make sure that it's not telling anything about yourself that you don't want it to be telling. So I mentioned the idea of depth because sometimes people will take that to the extreme, and then they, you know, are basically, you know, up against a blank wall. But when you do that, you look like you're getting your passport photo taken. So instead, you want to have a little bit of depth to your shot, meaning you have several feet between you and whatever is behind you. So raise your hand if you use a virtual background on a regular basis. Okay. Virtual backgrounds can be great. They can hide a wealth of chaos. They also can, you know, provide branding if that's something that is wanted. But you have to be cognizant that the AI that's used to create the virtual backgrounds is not perfect. And sometimes it doesn't know where you end and your background begins, and then it tends to eat body parts. It will eat my hair on a regular basis, or, you know, you'll put your hand up and then your fingers, you know, will disappear whenever you wiggle them around. So make sure that the background layers cleanly in your particular environment. If you have a lot of like kind of stuff in the background, it might not layer as nicely. If you have more of a blank canvas, it typically will layer a bit nicer than if you had a lot of stuff behind you. So the telehealth webcam tip number 2 is control the lighting. So it is so imperative that people read your facial expressions easily, because, you know, you have a way to communicate nonverbals. It's limited by the size of the screen, so you want to make sure you can maximize what can be seen. So you can see the person on the left-hand side decided, oh, I'm going to sit in front of this beautiful window because I have a great view. But then you're in silhouette. Backlighting it is bad in general. But then what she did was she turned around and she started facing the window. Natural lighting is typically very flattering, filtered, easy to produce if you're doing it during the day. However, most of us don't have the opportunity to face a window. So we're relying upon, overhead lighting like this. But you can see, and it's a little bit difficult with the lights in here, but you can see here, he has good lighting, but it's all coming down, and you get a downward cast, and then you have shadows around your eyes, which makes it difficult to create that eye contact. And eye contact is the best way to build trust and believability. So what he did on the right-hand side is he decided to do some, face level lighting so that you could easily see his face and read his facial expressions. So if you can do that, add that supplemental light, it will go a long way in how you're able to come across and how effectively you're able to communicate with the person on the other side. The other thing you have to think about is audio. All right, raise your hand if you use the microphone that's embedded in your laptop. Okay, all right, so here's, that's why I'm gonna slap you on the hand. No, and it may not be a terrible thing, but you wanna optimize your audio fidelity because people are much more tolerant of poor video quality than they are of poor audio quality. And the thing is, we can't tell how we sound. We can't hear ourselves. And typically people won't be like, hey, you sound like you're talking from a tin can. If I was on a call with you, I would. I'd be like, Joe.
That's why I have an external microphone, because of you.
Like, Joe, you're on the wrong audio channel. Switch it over. It's hurting my ears.
Yep.
But here's the thing. Your audio is affected by the acoustics in your room. And if you have a lot of hard spaces, meaning tile floors, hardwood floors, high ceilings, maybe windows without a lot of window treatments, that can create a really bouncy sound environment, especially for a laptop microphone. It's just not built to be able to manage that. So if you can do an external microphone, it's gonna be vastly better than if you just use your laptop microphones. And typically, this is a point if I'm doing a virtual one, I do like an audio hear and tell. Check it out with a friend of yours. Hop on a call and just switch between the different audio inputs and you'll hear what a difference it makes. If you're wondering what I use, this is typically what I'm using. It's a little USB lavalier microphone. I literally got it for 20 bucks on Amazon. And so if there's a place to invest, that's a place to invest. So what about how you're positioning your camera? So ideally you want to pick the right camera position for your patient. And that means you want your camera to be at eye level. So if you are using your laptop, you might be sitting at your desk and you have it down on the desk and then you end up looking something like this, where you're looking down on your patient. And as Joe mentioned, you're already dealing with kind of a status challenge that is made even worse by the fact that you're looking down on them. Now, if you are using an external webcam, maybe you have it perched on top of a monitor, well then you're looking up and you look like a little kid asking a parent for permission. So instead what you want to do is have your camera at eye level. You can do this in a variety of ways. If you're using a laptop, just put it on a stack of books. I know you got a lot of thick books around here, that's fantastic. You can get a laptop stand if you want to be fancy. If you have an external webcam, put it on a desktop tripod and then put it at eye level in a place that makes sense. So say for example you have a camera that is separate but you always use this one monitor. Put it as close to that monitor so that you can easily go from the camera to the faces of your patient without having to travel a long distance. It gets really hard whenever your camera's over here and your monitor's over here where their faces are. That's a long distance to travel. So you've got your camera at eye level. Oh, one more quick thing. If you see your ceiling in the shot, that is a good indication that your camera is pointing up. I don't want to see any more ceiling fans whirring above people's heads. So you have yourself in a situation where your camera's at eye level. How do you position yourself in the frame? Well, you want to make sure that you sit squarely in the frame. That means that you don't want to cut off body parts. You don't want to cut off your chin. You don't want to cut off the top of your head. Instead, you're going to shoot for something that's kind of like this, where you have an equal amount of space between each shoulder and the edges of the frame, and just a couple of inches between the top of your head and the top of the screen. So the best way to do this is to follow the 3-finger test. So when you are on your next virtual call, I want you to try this. All right, so raise your hand like this. I'm teasing. All right, so connect your thumb and your pinky. All right, take your temperature. Okay, put it on top of your head like this. That is the amount of space, 3 fingers, that you want to have between the top of your head and the top of the frame. And the reason why you want to do this is because when we're talking to people face to face, we don't talk to them like this. We're taking in their nonverbals from about this much space, so you want to create that canvas that they can read when you're on a virtual call. So any questions of what I covered? Anything that you have found troublesome? Yes?
What was your trick for eye contact on that external camera?
Well, in terms of
Making sure that I make proper eye contact.
well, you have to remember if you're speaking, that you're going to be looking primarily at that camera.
Yeah.
And then when you're not speaking, then you can go back to looking at the faces of the people who are. But that's when you want to provide that context. If I'm not looking at the camera, it's because I'm looking at you. And you're on my screen over here. So give that little bit of context, and then you remove any challenges.
There's another one that you talked about.
Oh, tell me. All right, what is it?
One thing she recommended to me when we first started working together was getting a sticky note and drawing a little face next to the camera.
Yeah.
Right, so that's your person. So you're talking to, I even named mine at home. That's Steve. So I
Oh,
always
you're
look
talking
at
to
Steve
Steve.
when I look at people in the eye. And it's yeah. So
Well, and
anyways,
it makes a difference. So
it does,
I
because
recommend
you're like, well, that's a person.
you put a picture of a person, or what I've had people do a lot is take googly eyes and put it on either side of their camera.
Oh.
And I had a former client reach out to me. She said, my googly eyes fell off, and I did a video, and I noticed I didn't look at the camera at all. I'm like, the power of the googly eyes. I mean, it really makes a big difference.
So get yourself some googly eyes or a
That's
picture of a person.
absolutely.
Draw Steve. It's
Yeah,
whatever you need to do.
and also changing your mind to realize, okay, it's not just me looking at googly eyes. This represents the person who I'm talking to on the other side. That makes the biggest difference. Other thoughts, other questions? Yeah.
One thing that I do when I have a bunch of people that I'm talking to is
Yeah.
rearrange the tile there
Yes.
to put the person that I am going to be responding to
Yeah.
closest to where I have the camera, right?
Perfect.
So it's not down in the corner, and I found that helps too.
Absolutely, yeah, and there are different configurations based upon the platform, how you can set that up. If you're using Teams a lot, it's harder to do that, and like in the middle of the conversation, they'll like shift your person to another side. But that's also, if you use Teams, that's also why I mentioned how important it is to frame yourself in the middle of the shot, because it will take your rectangle and make it a square without any warning. And you want to make sure you don't have half of your face cut off. Yes?
Oh, I had one comment, I have a boom microphone.
Nice.
Because, what you can do is just record yourself on Zoom through these different microphones.
Absolutely.
Play it back, and you realize, hey, this is horrible.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that idea. Yeah, try, just pick up, even the little earbuds that you used to get with your phone, where it has like that little, microphone on the wire. It actually has pretty good audio fidelity. I mean, it's crazy the difference that it can make, and it really improves the environment for the folks on the other side. So I want to leave you with this thought. Yesterday was the first day that Joe and I ever met in person. We have been working together for over 3 years. We wrote 3 books together. We created a hybrid meeting course. We've done countless webinars and podcasts and interviews together. He's one of my closest colleagues. I never met him in person. So if you are wondering if it's possible to build a relationship, to foster a relationship, to connect through the camera, we're proof positive that the answer is yes. So I will leave you with that thought. I'm happy to take any questions that remain. Yeah.
I do have a question, and it's related, not directly on this, but like in a month or so, I'm going to participate in a webinar, but it'll be a panel.
Okay.
What can be done when you yourself have less control over everything? How can I come across better?
You can control how you are set up, for one thing, right? Because you're going to be doing it from your home webcam or your office webcam.
Yes, it will be, yes.
Well, the fact that you have a boom microphone says a lot. So that tells me like you are aware of what you need to tweak.
I have lights and a green screen, so I
Oh my
don't get
gosh.
the fuzz.
You're so fancy.
It wasn't expensive. It really wasn't.
Right, exactly. It's not that much of an investment, and it makes a huge
I encourage
difference.
anyone to do it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, like you can get a green screen for like $20 on Amazon, and one that like sits right over the back of your chair. I mean, it makes a huge difference if you're using a virtual background. And lighting wise, you definitely want to be using something that will make you come across, crisper.
Something that's soft.
Yeah, and especially if you glasses, if you get one of those ring lights, you might get those little circles in your lenses. That's like a telltale sign. So the trick for that is you want to position them high and to the side. You're always battling the angle of reflection. So if you put it right behind your webcam, it's going to reflect right back on your lenses. So stick it up high, and then make sure it's off to the right or the left. And you can also, like, here's the other little quick trick. If you are wearing glasses, if you kind of tilt them up off of your ears slightly, typically the reflection will go out of them. I mean, it's very slight. My husband is follically challenged, so if he tries to do that, it looks weird. You can see his lenses, like his glasses got it going up. But yeah, lighting is huge. Lighting makes a big difference. Oh, in terms of coming across, so as a panelist, so if you're on a solo shot, you might be wondering, well, what should I do when I'm not speaking? The key is looking engaged. So I wouldn't necessarily say you have to be looking at the camera at that point, because your gaze directs the attention of those who are watching. So if you're looking at the camera, typically that signals to them that you have something to say. But if you are looking at the screen, then it's kind of like indicating that they should be looking at somebody else on the screen as well. And hopefully that person is looking at the camera.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other thoughts? Thanks for showing up today, everybody. I really appreciate it. And hopefully you took away some good tips.
All right, thanks everybody.